At first glance, it looked unstoppable, a massive chain of concrete, steel, and firepower stretching across the entire western edge of Europe. From the rocky coasts of Norway to the beaches of southern France, Nazi Germany called it the Atlantic Wall, an impenetrable barrier that would crush any invasion before it even began. To the world, it was a symbol of strength. To Hitler, it was the shield that would guarantee victory in the West. But beneath the surface of this enormous defensive system, cracks had already begun to form. Cracks that would turn into catastrophic failure the moment the Allies struck. The Atlantic Wall was not just a line of bunkers, it was one of the largest military construction projects in history. Tens of thousands of concrete fortifications were built along nearly 2,000 miles of coastline. Heavy artillery batteries were embedded into cliffs. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover every possible landing zone. Beaches were littered with obstacles designed to rip apart landing craft and drown soldiers before they reached the shore. Mines were buried in the sand, and steel barriers known as hedgehogs waited just beneath the tide. Everything was engineered to turn the coastline into a killing zone. But this fortress came at a cost. Over 300,000 laborers, many of them forced workers from occupied countries, were used to build it. They worked under brutal conditions, pouring concrete day and night, often with limited resources and under constant pressure. The scale of the project was so vast that it stretched German logistics to the limit. Materials were scarce, construction was rushed, and while some sections of the wall were heavily fortified, others were surprisingly weak. This unevenness would become one of Germany's greatest vulnerabilities. The Atlantic Wall looked terrifying on maps and in propaganda films, but in reality, it was inconsistent. Some areas had powerful guns and thick bunkers, while others relied on outdated equipment or thin defensive lines. In many places, the defenses were incomplete by 1944. Time, resources, and strategic priorities had forced Germany to spread itself too thin. There was also a deeper problem, one that could not be fixed with concrete or steel. The entire defensive strategy relied on predicting where the enemy would attack. German commanders knew an invasion was coming, it was inevitable, but they did not know when or where. This uncertainty forced them to defend an enormous coastline, making it impossible to concentrate their strength in one place. To compensate, Germany relied heavily on static defenses. The idea was simple: build strong enough fortifications so that even a surprise attack could be held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But this plan assumed something critical: that communication would be fast, decisions would be clear, and counterattacks would be immediate. In reality, none of those conditions were guaranteed. Even the weapons placed along the wall were not always what they seemed. Many artillery pieces were captured from other countries, repurposed and reused. Ammunition was sometimes limited. Some units stationed along the coast were not elite troops, but older soldiers, foreign conscripts, or men recovering from injuries. On paper, the Atlantic Wall looked like a modern defensive masterpiece. On the ground, it was a patchwork of strengths and weaknesses held together by hope. And then there was the illusion of control. German propaganda portrayed the wall as indestructible, creating a false sense of security at the highest levels of command. This overconfidence would prove dangerous. Instead of focusing on flexibility and rapid response, much of the strategy revolved around the belief that the wall itself could stop the invasion. But wars are not won by walls alone. They are won by coordination, timing, and the ability to adapt under pressure. The Atlantic Wall, for all its size and cost, was a static solution to a dynamic problem. It could not move, it could not think, and when the moment came, it would depend entirely on the decisions of the men behind it. By early 1944, the stage was set. The wall stood, at least in appearance. German forces waited, watching the horizon, knowing that somewhere beyond it, an invasion force was gathering. But what they did not fully realize was this: the greatest threat was not just the enemy approaching from the sea, it was the weaknesses already built into their own defense. The Atlantic Wall was not just a line of bunkers, it was a gamble that the Allies would attack where Germany expected, a gamble that the defenses would hold long enough, a gamble that command decisions would come quickly and correctly. And as history would soon reveal, it was a gamble Germany could not afford to lose.
Long before the first Allied soldiers set foot on the beaches of Normandy, the fate of Germany's defense was already being decided far behind the front lines, not by bullets or bombs, but by disagreement. At the heart of the Atlantic Wall strategy stood two of Germany's most experienced commanders, Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt. Both were highly respected, both understood the seriousness of the coming invasion, but they saw the battlefield in completely different ways, and that difference would prove disastrous. Rommel had learned hard lessons in North Africa. He had seen the overwhelming power of Allied air superiority. By 1944, the skies over Western Europe belonged to the Allies. German movements during daylight were constantly observed, attacked, and disrupted. Rommel understood that once the invasion began, moving reinforcements, especially armored divisions, would be incredibly difficult. Roads would be bombed, convoys destroyed, and communication lines cut. In his view, there was only one chance to stop the invasion: destroy it at the beaches immediately before the Allies could establish a foothold. He believed that tanks needed to be positioned close to the coast. The moment Allied troops landed, German armor had to strike with full force, pushing them back into the sea within the first hours. To Rommel, speed was everything. Delay meant defeat. Von Rundstedt saw things differently. As the overall commander in the West, he believed in a more traditional strategy. Instead of placing valuable Panzer divisions near the coastline where they could be vulnerable to naval bombardment, he wanted to keep them further inland. His plan was to allow the invasion to unfold, identify the main landing point, and then launch a massive, concentrated counterattack. He believed that flexibility and maneuver were the keys to victory, not static defense. At first glance, both strategies had logic. Rommel's plan prioritized immediate action and accounted for Allied air power. Rundstedt's approach focused on preserving strength and delivering a decisive blow at the right moment. But instead of choosing one clear strategy, Germany ended up with something far worse: a compromise. Panzer divisions, the most powerful units available, were split between different commands. Some were positioned near the coast under Rommel's influence, others were held back under Rundstedt's control, and a critical portion was placed under the direct authority of Adolf Hitler himself. This meant that in order to deploy certain armored units, commanders would need Hitler's personal approval. This fragmented command structure created confusion at the worst possible time. There was no single unified plan, no clear chain of command that could react instantly to a rapidly changing situation. Instead, decisions were delayed, debated, and often dependent on communication that could easily break down during an invasion. The problem wasn't just disagreement, it was timing. In modern warfare, minutes could decide the outcome of entire battles. On D-Day, hours would mean everything. And Germany had built a system that made rapid response almost impossible. Rommel, increasingly frustrated, pushed for more control and faster decision-making. He warned that the invasion would be decided in the first 24 hours. If the Allies were not stopped immediately, they would pour men and equipment onto the beaches faster than Germany could respond. But his warnings did not fully translate to action. Meanwhile, von Rundstedt remained confident that a well-executed counterattack could still destroy the invasion force, even if the Allies gained a temporary foothold. But this confidence depended on something that was becoming less and less realistic: the ability to move large armored formations quickly under constant Allied air attack. And then there was Hitler. His role added another layer of unpredictability. Convinced he alone could make the most critical decisions, he kept tight control over key Panzer reserves. But this control came at a cost. It slowed down response times and created uncertainty among commanders who needed to act fast, not wait for permission. As the invasion approached, the German defense in the West was not unified, it was divided, not just in positioning, but in philosophy. Should they fight at the beaches or strike from inland? Should they react immediately or wait for the decisive moment? These questions were never fully resolved. The result was a dangerous middle ground. Tanks were neither fully committed to the coast nor fully preserved for a concentrated counterattack. Command authority was spread across multiple levels, creating delays and confusion. And when the moment of truth arrived, Germany would not respond as a single coordinated force, but as a fractured system struggling to act under pressure. In war, clarity is power. A clear plan executed decisively can overcome even overwhelming odds. But uncertainty, hesitation, and divided leadership can turn strength into weakness. Germany had the weapons, it had experienced commanders, it even had time to prepare. What it did not have was unity. And when the Allies finally struck, that lack of unity would become impossible to hide.
By the spring of 1944, Nazi Germany was watching the horizon, waiting for an invasion that everyone knew was coming. The question was not if, but where. Along the entire western coastline of Europe, defenses were reinforced, troops were positioned, and commanders prepared for the moment that would decide the fate of the war in the West. But while Germany focused on strengthening its defenses, the Allies were preparing something far more dangerous than guns or tanks. They were preparing an illusion. It was called Operation Fortitude, and it would become one of the most successful deception operations in military history. Its goal was simple: convince Germany that the main invasion would not come at Normandy, but at a completely different location, the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. If the deception worked, Germany would keep its strongest forces away from the real battlefield at the exact moment they were needed most. To make this illusion believable, the Allies didn't just rely on false information, they built an entire fake army. This phantom force was known as the First United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by the aggressive and highly respected General George S. Patton. To German intelligence, Patton was one of the most dangerous Allied commanders. If an invasion were to happen, it made sense that he would lead it. That assumption became the foundation of the deception. In southeastern England, the Allies created the appearance of a massive military buildup. Inflatable tanks were placed in open fields, wooden aircraft sat on fake airfields, dummy landing craft lined the rivers and coasts. From the air, it looked like a powerful invasion force preparing for a direct strike across the English Channel. But up close, much of it was nothing more than carefully crafted props. The deception didn't stop there. Fake radio transmissions filled the air, simulating the communications of entire divisions. Double agents, German spies who had been captured and turned by the Allies, fed false information back to their handlers. These agents reported troop movements, supply preparations, and detailed plans that all pointed toward Pas de Calais as the primary invasion target. German intelligence believed it. The logic seemed sound. Pas de Calais was the closest point to Britain. It had better ports, shorter supply lines, and more strategic value. From a military perspective, it was the obvious choice. Normandy, by comparison, appeared less ideal, further away, with more challenging terrain and fewer immediate advantages. Everything the Germans saw confirmed what they already expected. And that was the true power of Operation Fortitude. It didn't try to create an unbelievable lie. It reinforced an assumption that Germany was already inclined to believe. As a result, even as Allied forces gathered for the real invasion of Normandy, German commanders remained focused on the wrong location. Entire divisions were held back, waiting for an attack that would never come. Even after the landings began on June 6, 1944, many German leaders were convinced that Normandy was just a diversion, a preliminary strike designed to draw attention away from the real invasion at Pas de Calais. For days and then weeks, this belief persisted. Nearly 150,000 German troops remained stationed in the Pas-de-Calais region, held in reserve for an attack that never happened. These were not minor forces. They included some of Germany's most capable units, divisions that could have made a critical difference in Normandy during the early stages of the invasion. But they never moved. The deception was so effective that even clear evidence failed to break it. Reports from the front, the scale of the landings, and the growing Allied presence in Normandy should have forced a reassessment. Yet the fear of a second, larger invasion kept German forces locked in place. Commanders hesitated, unwilling to commit their reserves too early and risk being unprepared for what they still believed was the main attack. Time passed, and in war, time is everything. Every hour that German reinforcements remained in Pas-de-Calais was another hour for the Allies to strengthen their position in Normandy. More troops landed, more equipment arrived, defensive lines expanded. What might have been a vulnerable beachhead began to transform into a solid foothold. Operation Fortitude had achieved its objective, not by destroying German forces, but by controlling their decisions. It turned uncertainty into paralysis. It made German commanders doubt what they were seeing with their own eyes. And most importantly, it ensured that when the real invasion came, Germany would be looking in the wrong direction. In the end, no bombs were needed to neutralize those 150,000 troops. No battles were fought to hold them in place. They were stopped by an idea, a carefully constructed illusion that reshaped the battlefield without a single shot being fired. And by the time Germany realized the truth, it was already too late. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the silence over the English Channel was broken by the distant rumble of engines. Thousands of ships moved through the darkness, carrying one of the largest invasion forces ever assembled. Above them, aircraft filled the sky, transporting paratroopers deep behind enemy lines. This was the beginning of Normandy landings, the moment when the Atlantic Wall would finally be tested. Before the first soldiers even reached the beaches, the invasion had already begun in the air. Allied paratroopers were dropped into the darkness across Normandy, tasked with securing bridges, cutting communication lines, and creating chaos behind German defenses. Many landed far from their intended drop zones, scattered across fields, forests, and flooded terrain. Units were disorganized, isolated, and often outnumbered. But this confusion had an unexpected effect. It made German commanders believe they were facing a much larger force than they actually were. As dawn approached, the horizon revealed a sight unlike anything the defenders had ever seen. An enormous fleet stretched across the sea, ships of every size moving toward the French coastline. Battleships and cruisers opened fire, sending massive shells crashing into German fortifications. The Atlantic Wall, built to stop an invasion, was now under relentless bombardment. Then came the landings. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced the most brutal resistance of the entire invasion. The terrain favored the defenders. High cliffs overlooked the shoreline, and German positions were deeply fortified. As landing craft approached, machine guns opened fire. Artillery shells tore through the incoming waves. Many soldiers were hit before they even reached the sand. Others drowned under the weight of their equipment. Within minutes, the beach became a scene of chaos and destruction. The carefully planned assault began to break down. Units were scattered, officers were killed, communication was lost. For a moment, it seemed possible that the attack at Omaha might fail completely, but small groups of soldiers began to push forward, finding gaps in the defenses, climbing the cliffs, and taking out German positions one by one. It was not a coordinated advance, it was survival, driven by individual action and determination. At Utah Beach, the situation unfolded very differently. Strong currents pushed the landing forces off course, causing them to come ashore in a less heavily defended area. What could have been a disaster turned into an unexpected advantage. Resistance was lighter, and American troops were able to move inland more quickly, securing key objectives with far fewer casualties than expected. Meanwhile, British and Canadian forces were landing on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Each faced its own challenges: coastal defenses, artillery fire, and counterattacks, but overall they made steady progress. Towns were captured, roads were secured, and the Allied foothold began to take shape. But while the battle raged along the coast, a critical problem was unfolding behind the German commands. Reports of the invasion reached headquarters in fragments. Some commanders believed it was the main attack. Others suspected it was a diversion, part of a larger deception. The scale of the landings was clear, but uncertainty remained. And in the middle of this uncertainty was a dangerous delay. Key Panzer divisions, the armored force that could potentially push the Allies back into the sea, were not immediately deployed. Some units required direct authorization from Adolf Hitler himself, but at the crucial moment, Hitler was asleep. No one wanted to wake him. Hours passed as the situation on the beaches evolved rapidly. German commanders requested permission to move armored units, but without clear approval, many hesitated. By the time orders were finally given, the opportunity for a decisive counterattack had already begun to slip away. At the same time, Allied air superiority made movement extremely dangerous. German convoys attempting to reach the front were attacked from above, slowing their advance and causing further delays. What should have been a rapid, coordinated response turned into a fragmented and ineffective reaction. By the end of the day, the outcome was becoming clear. Despite heavy casualties, especially at Omaha, the Allies had secured multiple beachheads. Troops, vehicles, and supplies continued to pour ashore. The Atlantic Wall had not stopped the invasion, it had only slowed it. The defenses that were meant to crush the enemy at the water's edge had failed to deliver a decisive blow, and the delays, confusion, and hesitation behind the lines had given the Allies exactly what they needed: time. D-Day was not a complete victory in a single moment. It was a fragile success, built on courage, sacrifice, and critical mistakes made by the defenders. But that fragile success was enough. Because once the Allies were firmly on the ground, the balance of the war in Western Europe began to shift, and Germany's chances of stopping the invasion started to fade. By the end of June 6, 1944, the magnitude of what had occurred became painfully clear. The beaches of Normandy were no longer mere points of landing. They had become footholds, vital positions from which the Allies could advance. Thousands of soldiers had fought through machine gun fire, artillery, and obstacles designed to destroy them before they reached the sand. They had secured exits from the beaches and pushed inland, capturing key roads, towns, and strategic positions. What the Germans had assumed would be a temporary intrusion was transforming into a permanent occupation. The Atlantic Wall, built at immense cost and hailed as indestructible, had failed in less than 24 hours. The failure was not just physical, it was operational. German Panzer divisions, which could have been decisive, were still immobilized. Some were delayed by the fragmented command structure that placed decision-making in multiple hands. Others were slowed by relentless Allied air attacks that dominated the skies, preventing movement and disrupting supply lines. Roads were cratered by bombs, bridges destroyed, and convoys ambushed. Even the units that could have counterattacked were arriving piecemeal, disorganized, and too late to change the battle's outcome. The human cost of this collapse was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of men had labored years constructing bunkers, gun emplacements, and defensive positions along the coast. Many were forced laborers from occupied countries, working under harsh conditions to pour concrete, dig trenches, and build obstacles meant to stop an invasion. Yet within a single day, all of that effort had been rendered largely meaningless. The defenses that were meant to halt the Allies at the water's edge were unable to prevent them from establishing a strong beachhead. Chaos at the command level only worsened the situation. Hitler's insistence on controlling key decisions personally slowed critical movements. The disagreements between Field Marshals Rommel and von Rundstedt left no clear strategy for deploying armored forces. Every request to move units or mount a counterattack had to navigate a maze of approvals, which delayed action and allowed the Allies to consolidate their positions. By the time German forces could respond, the Allies were already advancing, expanding their control of territory and preparing for the next phase of the operation. Meanwhile, the Allies pressed forward with relentless efficiency. Engineers cleared obstacles and mines under fire. Tanks advanced to support infantry, and artillery secured new positions for further assaults. Supply lines were quickly established, allowing reinforcements, vehicles, and ammunition to pour onto the beaches. The combination of disciplined planning, overwhelming firepower, and sheer determination ensured that the beachheads could not be dislodged. What had been intended as a formidable barrier had become a corridor for Allied expansion. By the evening, the collapse of the Atlantic Wall was undeniable. Sections of the coastline that had been fortified for years were in Allied hands. German units were fragmented and unable to coordinate effectively. The illusion of invincibility that had surrounded the wall was shattered. What had been projected as an unstoppable defense had failed under the weight of preparation, deception, and courage on the part of the attackers. The fall of the Atlantic Wall signaled the beginning of Germany's larger unraveling in Western Europe. Delays in command, poor communication, and misallocation of forces had created openings the Allies exploited with precision. Within days, the Normandy beachheads would expand, leading to the liberation of towns, ports, and eventually entire regions of France. The breach demonstrated the limits of static fortifications in modern warfare and highlighted the decisive impact of planning, leadership, and execution. In just 24 hours, Germany's fortress Europe had been broken. Years of construction, planning, and propaganda were undone, leaving the Allies with a crucial foothold that would change the course of the war and the collapse of the Atlantic Wall. The fall of the Atlantic Wall was a lesson in the vulnerability of even the most formidable defenses when faced with decisive action, coordination, and relentless determination. It marked the moment when the momentum shifted irreversibly, setting the stage for the liberation of Western Europe and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany.